All right. Today we've got Scott Waters, a counselor here in Oregon, uh, and really looking forward to hearing from Scott. His specialty is couples and marriage counseling, and it'll be great to hear uh, his wisdom and advice for couples and relationships. But thanks again, Scott, for coming on.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure, Savan.
It's fun because Scott is the first person to agree to come on the podcast. Really appreciate that, Scott.
Yeah, it's fun. It's a exciting adventure. I'm excited for you and where this is going to go. The
Great.
value you're going to add.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So, uh, could we start with sharing with our listeners your background?
Sure. Yeah. So, um, I am a Christian therapist, and I think that starts really with, I'll say I'm a therapist who identifies as Christian, unless that lead his therapy. Which is, I think, an important distinction between a biblical counselor, which is, Bible first, psychology maybe, or a counselor who is a Christian but doesn't let that influence their therapy. And so I was raised in the church, and growing up, I really wanted to serve in some capacity. My mom is a pastor's kid. Both of her parents were pastors. And so I wanted to serve to some degree. And, in high school, my preface for that, or the only way that made sense for that to work for me was to be a youth pastor. Like, that was my only frame of reference.
Right.
And so when I got into college, I started religion and Christian ministries, or actually music and youth. And I went through three different fields of interest, like before I landed on human development. I didn't like church politics, but I did, come to realize politics are in everything in terms of getting things done, especially as an entrepreneur.
You mean within the church?
Yeah, within the church.
Did do some internship or student ministry?
Yeah, I did a
Experience?
couple internships, different churches, and I was like, man, I don't like it. Like, you got to go through other people to get things done. And I'm an Enneagram 2 wing 3, and I think as part of that, like, just drive to do what I wanted to do, which kind of came to that conclusion for me. So yeah, I tried education. I went through English, history, and then I landed on human development because it's what made the most sense for me. And
nice. That fit.
Yeah, it just fit. It resonated with me, like understanding how people think and they work, and just connecting with that. It was huge for me. And then my last year, I was like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I took an intro to counseling class and an abnormal psychology class. And that was like, oh, I could do this, like serving one-on-one. And that really fits my personality, like my skill set of listening well, connecting with others, trying to help. The two is known as a helper typically. And so it just kind of made sense for me to live into that and go that route. And that was when I chose to go to Western Seminary and get my master's in counseling.
Nice. So pretty straight from undergrad to grad school.
I graduated in December. I took 4.5 years, cycling through 4 different degrees. It kind of added a little bit.
Yeah.
But I took a semester off. So I took that spring and summer and then started that following fall. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so tell me a little bit about going through the grad school. What were some of the kind of the key ideas, or how did you develop your
As
interest as a couples therapist?
well, actually, so as part of Western Seminary's program, which I think should be required in any program, you had to get your own personal counseling and 20 hours of it, which I think is awesome, and 10 of group, I think. I hope they still do that. But my personal counseling uh, required me to walk through my own struggles with sexual addiction.
Mm.
And so that's where I got my first start as a counselor, is also working with sexual addiction and helping men work through that. Um, and so I kind of joined this nonprofit and got my feet wet there as I was going to school, doing pastoral counseling. So more of the biblical based kind of addiction model of counseling. And really, like, it was good. It was hard. It was good training along with the internships that I was going through at Western. But I noticed, as much as I help a guy work through his addiction, there's a marriage that's left wanting, and there's so much growth and health and recovery, redeeming work that needs to happen in the relationship.
Mm.
And a guy getting clean and figuring out how to do sobriety well was only part of the equation. And so I really found myself leaning towards helping this, this hurting relationship. And that's what got me on the track for marriage counseling or couples counseling. I still do some addiction work, but that's far and few between.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And
There,
you, you've got a family of your own. Can you share a little bit about uh, your family, and also how your work has impacted your family?
yeah. So part of my, so family. I've been married for 13 years, 13 and a half. We met in college. We have 2 kiddos. Um, so it's kind of a crazy, you talk about like overcoming some hardships, like working multiple jobs, going to grad school, having kiddos, buying a house, and then, just after graduating, like, moving down here to Springfield, Eugene area from Vancouver, Washington. So it was a lot of transition. It felt like it never stopped. I'm just now learning how to take time for myself in that self-care and
Mm.
balance what it actually means to take a vacation, because I've never actually taken one, uh, like a week off to actually go somewhere, or like what people think of as a typical vacation.
Mm.
Um, yeah, it's just,
Awesome. You were just in that pace, that
oh yeah,
mode of school and work and family for so long, and building your practice. Uh,
yeah.
mm.
And so in building the practice, that's another hard shift where there came a point in our family life where it was important for us to be closer to one set of parents. My parents are up in Olympia, hers are down here in Springfield, and we just needed that support. We weren't really engaged as well as we'd like with the church community, and it wasn't there in terms of like meeting that need of support. And so we decided to move down here,
Mm.
which meant that I had to relaunch my practice.
Oh, because you were, after graduating, you were setting up shop in Vancouver.
Yep, just starting to,
Mm. Mm.
graduate in 2014 and started my private practice there. Still working at the nonprofit, still working at Starbucks. I had 3 gigs going,
Wow.
trying to make it all work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I just transitioned from uh, the Starbucks, which was this like stable force through my career, and landscaping, like during grad school, to just Starbucks and more counseling. And it's this kind of pendulum swift from counseling in Starbucks to more counseling and less Starbucks.
Yes.
And I think that was a healthy shift for me, but also really grounding,
Mm.
in learning customer service. And
Mm.
even I remember my interview process for Starbucks, they said, do you have leather skin? Like, can you handle criticism or people's rough emotions? Because that is ultimately,
Mm.
someone comes in for a latte and they're just frustrated or angry and they might take it out on you, and it's not about you at all. And so that kind of helped me, along with something that one of my professors said, Norm Thiessen was like, you have to leave your ego at the door
Mm.
if you want to be a good therapist. And that's really helped me to grow into being resilient
To
with
remember that.
clients.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
as a two,
Yep.
um, it does being a helper, does it make it easier to handle people's like negative feedback or criticism, or does that make it harder? Does it make you more sensitive to that?
I think in my unhealth or stress or immaturity, especially early on, I was probably more sensitive to it, because being a helper, I wanted to internalize all of it and make it about me.
Hmm.
Um,
What
you
you
know, the
could do better to fix it
right,
or make it better.
or I'd take responsibility for their emotional baggage or their emotional work, and ultimately that's not helpful. I'm there to walk and sojourn with them.
Hmm.
And so that was a big growth area for me, is to learning those boundaries to take care of myself and then consequently take care of them. Because as soon as I released myself from the responsibility of fixing their emotions
Hmm.
and just learning to be with, that like Christ-centered approach of Emmanuel, like God with us, like if I could embody that better
Hmm.
just out of grace, like then I'll be a more effective counselor and it won't affect me as personally. And that's part of a big thing for my uh, growth as a counselor, I'd say.
Nice. I think even for folks listening that aren't in counseling, but if you work with, if you're in ministry or leadership, that's huge, and in relationships as parents,
Absolutely.
or in a couple, um, not taking responsibility for someone's emotional uh, baggage,
Yeah.
but supporting them. That's a constant tension. So
It's a
yeah.
huge need,
Hmm. Right now
and it's,
too.
oh, absolutely, especially
Yeah.
with the pandemic. And I think it's a skill that needs to be developed ultimately. And I'm still working on it every day. Like I still suck at it sometimes. And my 5-year-old throws a temper tantrum, and like I can let it become about me if I'm not careful, you
Mm.
know, and especially for as parents, like that's a really big growth area, is to say, okay, like what's actually going on in the kiddo
Mm.
versus like, this is inconvenient for me as a parent to deal with. So I'm just going to tell them to take a time out or be punitive in my response, or in a couple situation, like allow them, like often when someone shares their experience, it's really them sharing their experience. It's not meant to be an attack or personal threat, but
Mm.
when our ego gets in the way, we make it about us, and it shifts from them sharing to me being defensive.
Right.
And at that point, there's no connection, there's no growth, there's no intimacy there. It's you both switched into that defense mode. And as we know from like Gottman's training, like that's a destroyer of relationships if that's where you allow it to stay, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so a lot of my coaching or counseling is involved like helping equip couples and parents to grow in that area of
Mm.
being intentional with that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, uh, speaking of coaching and counseling couples,
Yeah.
can we shift to talking a little bit about your work with couples?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so as I was I've kind of formatted my own process for couples coming from the sexual addiction, like really focusing on communication and how to help people connect, because the goal is connection of most communication, right? Even if it's a statement of sharing where you're at, you're still saying, this is how we are connecting, right? Even a business relationship, it's about connection, right? And so that was a huge focus of how I theorized working with couples and helping relationships better, is on that, on that communication piece. Uh, but as I grew and I was challenged by um, one of my peers, Paul Elmore, he really challenged and pushed me to have a framework for success. What does it look like for a couple to succeed in a relationship? And so, using some of Gottman's research that I was forming in my own orientation, and a book by Atkinson on um, conflict resolution in couples, that really shaped the way I addressed it, but I didn't really have a framework or a steps to follow in regard to how that worked. Um, and so he challenged me to figure that out, and I borrowed an acronym from him and made it my own, as all good scholars do, steal things. And I came up with the relationship values. And so what that looks like is, values is an acronym for vulnerable, accountable, learning, understanding, empathy, and shared meaning. So some of these are things that Gottman's talked through, and others are just things that make the acronym work, that are key principles of relational success. And so you want me to walk through those each individually?
Yeah. So if a couple comes to you,
Yeah.
and they're having trouble with conflict and communication, they're under a lot of stress because they're not feeling understood. Kind of walk
Right.
us through how it would look like with a couple.
Yeah. I think I let them kind of show me what's going on at home, what's going on behind closed doors. And I'll actually let them fight for a little bit, so I get to see like what some of the issues are, what the frustrations are. I don't let that go on very long. I'm actually very directive in my couples therapy, because they need to practice and learn a different behavior and skill than what they've been rehearsing and practicing at home. And so the goal of couples therapy is to kind of identify what's going on that's dysfunctional, and then teach them the skills that specifically address, with interventions, the patterns of dysfunction in their connecting at home. And that could be conversation, that could be lack of empathy. It could be a lot of things, but I think the values acronym really addresses all aspects of relationship. And so I try to walk them through what that looks like and really develop those patterns. I do a lot of psychoeducation in session, but also it has to be practical, and we have to practice it.
Yeah.
Some of the biggest breakthrough only comes when they're able to rehearse a different story than what they have in their head.
Mm-hmm. So you're
Brene Brown talks about in her work, uh, uh, pardon the language, but a shitty first draft.
like it doesn't go well
And
when you're starting something new, when you're trying to write something or create something different.
well, it's more of actually like the assumptions that you are writing in your head. Like, so I talked earlier about like someone sharing their experience, and the other person makes it about them and their insecurity or issues, instead of the person who's actually sharing, which is a giving support through empathy.
Mm.
And so what typically happens in that interaction is someone shares their experience, and because we are egocentric by nature often, or in my case as a two, I want to take ownership for someone's responsibility for their emotion or figure out my part of what I did wrong.
Mhm.
That's my wounding that I had to work out. But I wrote an assumption based on that interaction of their intent, their like what I did wrong, what their assumptions were about me. Like I wrote this whole story in my head
Mm.
because I wanted to fill the blanks in what they were trying to communicate or why,
Oh yeah,
right?
that's
Like,
huge. When you get it wrong,
oh yeah,
when misinterpret or you rehearse something that isn't accurate.
right.
Um,
But
yeah.
but we do it all the time,
Mm.
whether it's with kiddos, with coworkers, with significant others. And so one of the main goals is to stop and like notice, what assumptions am I making,
Mm.
and not even talking about, but just acting on, right? Because that's the way our limbic system works,
Right.
reactive.
It's funny in the movies when when
Right.
when there's like just comedy of errors when you
Yeah.
like an assumption and you're not communicating but you're just like reacting to each other, but it's painful
Oh yeah.
in marriage in home. So would like pausing to really evaluate that story that you're telling yourself, would that be part of the understanding in your values framework?
Yeah, it also takes vulnerability
Okay, yeah, can you
because,
explain that? Yeah.
yeah. So, and we can just walk through these real quick. Vulnerability is the amount of openness and receptiveness you have in your relationship. Um, all aspects of vulnerability require risk. And so, um, if you want emotional relationship depth, it requires vulnerability. Intimacy requires vulnerability. You have to share about yourself, your values, your opinions, ways of doing things. And um, so it's required to build intimacy. Often when there's conflict, because of the patterns we have uh, in the relationship for communicating, we assume, oh, I don't want to make it worse by speaking what's going on inside of me. But in that process, and I've seen it in so many relationships, you're closing your partner or spouse off from getting to know you.
Yes. Yeah.
Like it's a roadblock for intimacy by not sharing.
Hmm.
And there's lots of different reasons why that happens. You don't want to burden them. You think it's going to bring more conflict. Those are two of the main ones. But
Right.
it's it, you have to engage in vulnerability, and that requires courage, right?
Yes.
Of
Yeah.
doing hard things, even though emotionally you want to stay safe.
Yeah. And it goes both ways, but
Yep.
guys really struggle with the vulnerability. Um,
Yeah.
and that you said earlier, sharing your thoughts and your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, growing up, a lot of folks, what they thought or felt um, didn't matter,
Yeah.
or they learned that uh, what they thought and felt was less important
Right.
than others, their parents or others in their family. And
Yeah.
so it's hard when you want to connect, but it just seems being vulnerable is super uncomfortable. And yeah,
It's
so
very uncomfortable.
you talked about kind of like the skill, um,
Yeah.
and then you teach folks. So how do you help Scott, husbands or wives,
Sure.
men and women, um, be
Yeah.
more vulnerable in this area, take that risk?
I think a large part of it is self-awareness, you know,
Hmm.
because our limbic system hijacks our brain and shuts off access to the prefrontal cortex, the whole survival fight or flight, freeze, or submit, actually, I think is the latest addition to that. We we literally can't engage, like we're not aware, we're just reacting.
Hmm.
And so a huge part of what helps address conflict is slowing down and just being aware of yourself, noticing, and then you have an option at least you have an option at that point to do something different. But so often we're just reactionary and responding, not thoughtfully or intentionally, but just out of self-preservation or survival. And that means we do and say things that are regrettable in our relationships. And so
Yeah.
the main way I teach that is mindfulness. And just to clarify for those that are listening, mindfulness is simply an awareness of your body, awareness of what's going on inside of you. And it looks more like just focusing on your breathing and allowing your thoughts and emotions, which you didn't choose often, they're coming into your consciousness, to be there without you taking action on them. And so a good practice, which is really small, is just to start every day, just 30 seconds, closing your eyes, getting in a comfortable position, not laying down necessarily, maybe laying down, but being mindful of your breathing, just the air coming in and out of your body, and letting your emotions and thoughts that are coming in at 1,000 times a second, like, to just be there.
Hmm.
They don't need to influence you taking action, just to let them simply like roll by like a train. Like, you're going to let those carts roll by. You don't have to do anything with them. You try to grab every one of them, and of course you get overwhelmed, right? And so it's a practice of learning to be aware of it, but not take action
Hmm.
in a reactionary way.
Yeah.
Um,
Just as
and
you're
that translates
just
into all sorts of skill. But go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, just as you were describing that, I was doing some breathing. I could just feel getting in
Yeah.
touch with being tired, even even though I got a good night of sleep.
Yeah.
There's some
Absolutely.
some underlying tiredness and got in touch with just a few seconds, just like 10 seconds right
Yep.
there. So 30 seconds of that slowing down can help with changing that, like that habit of being defensive,
Yes.
that habit of being
Yeah.
critical or saying regrettable things. It's
Yeah.
uh we're but it was interesting. I really like mindfulness. You usually think of the mind and thought,
Right.
but you started awareness of your body. um
Yeah.
I think with the pace of life and not and gyms being closed down and things like that and being on screens for so long, we're like disconnected from our bodies, um
Very much so.
and so much in our heads um
Yeah.
and we're we're talking about connection as a couple with your partners or even your kids.
Yeah.
Like we're not even connected with ourselves.
Right.
And self-awareness, slowing down, mindfulness, that's a great step for vulnerability. So tell me about accountability. For
Yeah.
accountability has like a negative connotation. So what do you mean by accountability in relationship?
Yeah. That's interesting. There is a negative connotation with accountability, isn't there? People are like, oh, like, well, especially coming out of like sexual addiction circles or like church, accountability is like you have something wrong with you that you need somebody to support you, right? It's kind of like the stigma of mental health in what was church or our community, which I think is shifting and growing, but still present for sure.
Hmm.
Is, oh, you only get help when you're quote unquote crazy, right?
Hmm.
And that's such a painful and devastating kind of myth or assumption about mental health.
Yeah. So
Um,
you're either crazy or you're bad. You're doing
or
something bad,
or you're broken,
broken.
right? Like, and all of us in our uh, hopefully spiritual maturity would say, yes, we are broken, and thankfully God restores.
Hmm.
right? Like that's the healthy reframe for that.
Mm. What's
Um,
the emphasis, and what do we land with on?
well, so I've been trying to incorporate more of the work of the gospel into my therapy and just my understanding of personality. I'm
Mm.
doing some Enneagram training right now. And it really all goes back to the gospel and how, like, as I talk about self awareness, another aspect of that is self compassion, right? Even if we're aware of our own insecurities and frustrations or issues, if we don't have self compassion, it's not safe to address them because we stigmatize ourselves, our own issues, as being unlovable, unable to affect change. And so, if our starting point is, well, God sent his son to die on the cross to forgive us of sins and make us perfect in his eyes, blameless, clean as snow, washing the slate of transgressions,
Mm.
done continuously, right? Not just once for this set of sins or this set of issues, but for all eternity,
Mm.
right? If that's our starting point, I see the biggest issue of it in our church is not accepting that that's the work that was done for us. And so we dive into self-criticism, self-judgment. And if that's where we land, we're going to project that onto our relationships,
Right, right.
right? But
Or
if
if
we
we don't
can,
see other people with
yeah,
that reality.
yeah, if we don't see other people as the way God sees them or see ourselves the way God sees us,
Hmm.
like we're going to fall into these negative coping patterns, right? Or negative communication patterns because we're not radically accepting ourselves the way God sees us as his kids that need to be loved and cared for, you know?
Hmm.
Like I use the metaphor of adoption, and it's it's even in scripture.
It's
Like
biblical. Yeah.
God adopted us into his kingdom, and that the more I learned about foster care, my wife and I thought about doing foster care at some point.
Hmm.
That didn't happen, but it was good learning about it because it helped me understand the mentality that comes from being a foster care kiddo.
Hmm.
And it's a scarcity mentality. Like you're fearful, you're always looking for stability, but the way you try to prove that is by being uh like negative or unhealthy. Like you're pushing boundaries to see if they will accept or love you,
Hmm. Just testing that.
just testing it constantly, right? Which is
Hmm.
the natural state of childhood, right? Constantly learning boundaries.
Hmm.
Um,
Because because need the reassurance. Is that the
yeah, like
goal?
we're trying to, the goals. You're breaking up there. Go ahead.
Oh, we had a pause in signal. I didn't say anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're constantly striving for, am I okay? Are we okay? Right? And those two questions, like self-worth, value, understanding, and uh, are we okay? Do you see value in me? Is our relationship solid? Right? And so coming out of foster care, which we could say all our parents, uh, maybe our foster parents, they're a temporary holding pattern and they failed us in some way. But moving into this understanding or acceptance of God's unconditional, caring, justified love, boundless mercy, steadfast love to generations, right? Like there's peace that comes with that, but we still have these neurological ingrained pathways that we developed as throughout our life, up, up long into adulthood, which don't serve us well. They don't serve us, they don't serve our relationships, and reinforce that we're not safe, we're not loved, we're not lovable. And so if we have a starting point of grounding ourselves in the love of God, then that enables us to feel peace internally and then externally in relationships,
Mhm. I like
right?
that, Scott. Yeah. like the whole basis for self-compassion
Yeah.
is is God's love.
Yeah. It's
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
And that's where I'd say accountability, bringing it back to the values, is that when we hold ourselves accountable to being proactive, intentional, and responsible, like there's nothing you can't work out in a relationship, right? Because, well, we can work on that.
Mm,
But I think the problem is when we fall into a victim mentality because of our upbringing, those internal scripts that keep running our life subconsciously, like we have a hard time being accountable. I think that's why there's this bristling or angst with the word accountability, because ultimately we want to say, well, there's circumstances outside of our control that made me do what I did or think the way I thought or felt the way I did. And the reality is, we always have choice over what we do,
mm,
what we take action on, right? And this is the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy is my feelings are outside of my control. They're involuntary. So that's another just sidebar. We can't, when a spouse says or a parent says, you shouldn't feel that way, they don't have any control over that.
mm.
Like, how dare you tell them what they should or shouldn't feel? Like, let's stop there and just say with compassion, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way. Like,
So important.
that sounds so hard,
Mm,
right? But if we're stuck in our own assumption that it's our responsibility, our fault, or that thing is bad, right? Assigning good or bad to an emotion as opposed to saying it just is,
mm,
and having radical acceptance of it, not the power of it, but just the acceptance of its presence, then we can work through it and hold ourselves accountable and ultimately hold others accountable with grace and compassion
mm.
and empathy and understanding and curiosity, which we'll get into in the rest of the values.
Yeah.
But it starts with, like, I'm reading this book, Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, like Navy SEALs trained,
Tough guy, Navy SEAL,
tough dude. Yeah.
jiu-jitsu guy. Yeah.
But crazy amount of ownership for himself. And as he's leading teams of people, like ultimately taking that responsibility, which is the biggest, like the grounding force of that is humility, right? I
Mm.
have to start out being humble before I can take responsibility. Otherwise, it just turns into a blame game,
Yeah.
and
You shift
you're
it. You
shifting
don't own it.
responsibility. You're always blaming. It's always I'm entitled or victim of, as opposed to saying like, well, no, like I'm the hero in my own story. Like I can make these choices even if I feel a certain way or even if I think a certain way that's connected with that emotion. Like I can choose different, right? And that's where therapy comes into play. So if you
Mm.
guys are, if your listeners are struggling with that, like that's where I'd encourage you to go, is to work that stuff out, those assumptions, those core beliefs about your value and worth in therapy, so
Yeah.
that you can show up being accountable to being the best person you can be in that relationship,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's all also goes back to like covenant, a relationship covenant, which I think is the basis of a marriage. Like you are committing to show up a certain way in the relationship, with kindness, with gentleness, with grace, with understanding, with care. But we often forget that, and we get this, we get caught up in our assumptions like we've talked about. And so taking a posture of accountability is really being proactive. Like, I'm sorry, and sitting in humbleness, humility.
Yeah. That's so good. I see how they're building, because
Yeah.
that vulnerability provides the grace and the safety to be humble
Yeah.
and take responsibility. Um,
Yeah.
that and that you're not going to get punished
Right.
for being humble or taking responsibility. And
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then you mentioned curiosity. So,
Yeah.
tell us more about learning and understanding.
Yeah, because that is that is learning. It's establishing curiosity for yourself and your partner. And again, you're right. It is building on each other. Like, you can only have curiosity when you start to take ownership for yourself and are willing to risk being vulnerable. And when you sit in this posture of curiosity, you're saying, I'm going to accept and love, specifically in a partnership or spousal relationship, who you are, not just now, but 5 or 10 or 20 or 35 years from now. Because I know, just because I grow and change every day, and I'm not who I was 5 years ago or even last month,
Hmm.
that you're doing the same transition and change and adjusting to surroundings. And that's human nature, is to adapt and flex. As much as we hate change, we are constantly doing it. And showing up with curiosity in a relationship is saying, I'm going to accept where you are in the process of your change.
Yeah. That so. How would you help uh, a couple, Scott, where they feel like they are changing, and the changing is like moving them apart from each other?
Mm,
Um, and like pandemic, we're kind of stuck close
yeah.
together. Uh,
Yeah.
so maybe like physically that we're not moving apart as much,
Right.
but maybe internally, like whether it's uh, for example, maybe someone wants to go back to church when
Mm-hmm.
church opens up, and maybe someone in the family has uh, change their views about church or even their faith, and maybe they're not wanting to do online service, like they're tired of
Yeah.
online service. And it's not just online service they're tired about, they're like moving away from maybe
Church or
their
faith.
church or their faith.
Yeah. I think so. A natural part of relationship is compromise. When I say compromise, I don't mean losing the identity of who you are. When I say compromise, it's really accepting that, to get to this last point of shared meaning, we have to be curious and engage with where they're going and how that fits into an us
Hmm.
right now and in the future. Right. Um, and I think so many divorces happen because people don't have room for, that's not who I married. Like, I hear that a lot. Like, this person that I'm with
Right.
right now is not who I married. And that's unfortunate because they're not accepting or curious about who this person is today or where they're going. And so, to use your example, maybe someone who wants to go back to church, they can't wait to get back into that community. Maybe they're more extroverted.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe the introvert, or just even someone who's been hurt by the church during this time, is like, no, like, I don't, like, I just need space. Like, that's okay.
Hmm.
Like, it doesn't mean that you can't function in a relationship. That's an opportunity to show grace and compassion and find a compromise. Maybe one of the person who wants to go back uh, can ask how to do that respectfully. Maybe it's about, you know, being worried about COVID. Well, how can I do that honors my desire and need for community and is respectful to you, not wanting to engage or show that, like, to come back.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's really like, the goal is a win-win. You know, the Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that book also influenced a lot of this kind of, like, this values framework, because we're ultimately searching for a win-win.
Hmm.
Because if just one of us wins, we both lose relationally. And so to really help couples say, well, how can we both win? Like, what does that look like? And it may not look like completely to one person's standard, but if you both feel respected, cared for, and loved, it's a win, right?
Yeah.
And so striving to find that, but to do that, you have to be humble, right? It can't be my way or the highway. You can't fall into that judgmental attitude, which is like criticism or contempt. I'm right, you're wrong. You have to truly check yourself at the door and say, okay, how can we make this work? And I would encourage couples to start using that language, we, us,
Yes. Yeah.
right?
Um, yeah. When you say we and us out loud, you feel more connected.
Absolutely.
It shifts your mindset from like, oh, not just thinking about yourself, but including
Yeah.
the other person. Similar to what you just described, one thing I try to help couples with is, instead of framing it as like right or wrong, and
Yeah.
then you're just like arguing your positions or
Yeah.
getting intense to make the other person wrong,
Right.
is to share, not right or wrong, but this is what I would like, this is what I want, or what I need. What do we
Yeah.
need versus this is the right way to do things and you're
Right.
wrong. So even if you work things through to a decision, but you make the
Right.
other person feel wrong or make them wrong, then
Right.
it um that doesn't feel great. um
No.
and versus, oh, we're doing this because that's what you would like, it's your preference,
Yeah.
and it's not right or wrong or better, it's just
Right.
what you want. And
Yeah.
like, yeah, I can do that, I can help you with that, it's fine.
Right.
um and the so but that all of that takes better communication.
It takes openness too, right?
Mm,
Part of that, going back to that vulnerability,
mm,
if they're not open to receiving the other person's input or their experience is valid and equally as important,
mm.
this isn't going to work,
Yeah, yeah. That's
right?
that's the tough spots.
Yeah,
That's the tough spots in couples counseling.
it is,
When
because it's
someone's
like,
kind of like locked in and
yeah,
not moving. Um, yeah.
yeah. It's kind of like, hey, we need dinner on the table. Okay, like I can put dinner on the table. It may not look the way you hope it looks, but you'll get some food in your belly. Like, we'll be okay.
Mm,
Are you willing to accept that food? Or are you just going to say, nope, that's not what I was wanting,
hmm.
throw it out,
Not good enough. Yeah.
not good enough? Like, wow, like that's a rigid mentality. We have
Mm,
to really shift into this growth mentality and accept and create change and be proactive. Like so you talked earlier about like road bumps, whether it's like going back to church or accepting other people's difference. A big thing for me that I've come to learn is, when you come up on conflict, that's opportunity. Like any kind of speed bump in life is an opportunity to grow, which is a growth mentality. You can't get there if you're in a victim mentality, right?
mm,
Because a speed bump means, oh, I shouldn't have done this. Of course, you're feeding all of that negative self talk in your brain,
mm.
either about your relationship or about yourself. You're like, oh, we weren't meant to be together because this thing didn't go right.
Right.
And it's like, well,
It
no,
reinforces all that
it
negative.
can. Yeah.
Mm.
And so, like,
What's the better way, Scott?
yeah,
When
the
I'm
better.
like, if someone's starting to do that, like, how
Yeah.
do you break out of that? How do you shift?
Well, I think going back to some of the Gottman's work is, what's the understandable part, right?
Mm.
Trying to
So
say,
in a speed bump, we hit a speed bump, we a conflict.
yeah.
So trying to pause and try to ask yourself, what's the understandable part?
And that really, the basis of that, Savon, is compassion,
Mm,
right? To show myself compassion in the speed bump as opposed to criticism or contempt. Say, I'm not good enough, or this isn't good enough. To
mm,
say, oh, it makes sense that this doesn't feel very good. Okay. Like, yeah, we can feel that for a minute.
This makes sense. Yeah.
And
That's so good, because this is what happens is
yeah,
in couples is someone does something like they agreed to be home on time or take out the trash or whatever,
right,
and then their spouse gives them feedback like, hey, you said you were going to do that, and like I'm hurt that you didn't call and you're 2 hours late,
right.
and you know I made dinner for you and it's cold,
Yeah,
instead of, oh man, I'm sorry, like I should have called you, I should have texted you. It's like, yeah, you're right, I'm a failure, I'm terrible, I like,
right.
it's like not, it's like looks and sounds like you're taking responsibility and you're like this awful person, but you're
Yep,
not really, because you're making it about yourself. You're not
right.
showing empathy for the other person.
Yeah, which creates conflict. It creates more conflict, right? Like you're not just accepting that responsibility and how can we grow and change. It's you're right, I'm a horrible person. Well, now the conflict is like, well, we didn't resolve anything. Like now the person who's saying they're hurt to begin with has to shift and show compassion for the other person who did the wrong.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
it's a toxic cycle, really.
Mm.
And taken to extremes, this is where narcissism or uh, you know, codependent relationships take on a whole new level, right? Like that's on the far end of the spectrum of not being able to be humble and take ownership for your actions.
Mm.
But you stopped understanding, you stopped being curious about your own life, much less the person in front of you who's trying to love you well.
Man, yeah. And that's the those are the low points. It's
Oh
really
yeah.
lonely. And couples go through that for years before they come and talk to us.
Oh,
I'm
7 years.
yeah.
Like that's what research says. 7 years too late. Like
Mm.
they've been repeating this junk for 7 years and it's been a conflict. And then it's like, oh, we should probably, or we have to work on this.
Mm. Yeah.
It's like, you've entrenched this pattern for 7 years without doing anything different. This is going to take some work. Like you're in for an uphill battle. So please don't come in for a couple sessions and say, oh, we tried counseling, and then it fails because you stopped trying.
Mm.
Like you're rewiring your brain in how to engage with someone healthfully. So it takes time,
Take some time. Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and intentionality, right? We have to be accountable to that and showing up that way.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, if you're struggling in relationship, you're listening uh in with Scott and I, uh definitely encourage you to get started, and
Yeah.
not wait till it's so hard. And the hard part, and you've seen this, Scott, like uh we're giving it a shot, like we're giving it our
Right.
last shot,
Yeah.
but you're so tired and worn down from the hurt and the
Yeah.
stress and the dysfunction. It's hard to do the hard work. um,
Absolutely.
and so yeah, we, like, Scott is speaking pretty clearly and directly, but you could tell, like, Scott cares about uh, you, if you're listening, and
Yeah.
his couples, like, we um we just understand that it's it's so hard, um
Yeah.
especially when it's been hard for so long. That's why we're both passionate about, guys, don't wait 7 years.
Right.
Yeah. So say go ahead, Scott.
I was just gonna say there are so many times, Savannah. I know you've shared this just in your personal journey working with couples. Like I am so passionate about redeeming relationships,
Mm,
helping them work through it. Like even even in my sessions, often I'll be explaining how this works and why it's important, and I will be brought to tears because there's something that can be done.
mm,
And there's so much hope to be had if you would accept it and receive it and try.
yeah.
You know, And it does break our hearts. Like, it's devastating because it doesn't have to be this way, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Thank you, Scott.
And
So we've got two more on the
yeah.
values framework. Share.
So after understanding, which is just not even saying you agree, right? So I want to preface that too.
Mm,
Saying you understand something about the other person's experience doesn't mean you agree with it. People having different experiences is just that, like, they're different experiences. That's natural, that's normal, that's okay. They don't have to completely agree with your experience, but you do have to try to understand it. And that's where I would differentiate and say, you don't have to agree. Simply try to understand what part makes sense to you. And for that to really work, it requires empathy. Being able to say, like, I care about you and I'm with you in this frustrating time, in this conflict, in this pain, right? You talked earlier about just how we can reflect God clearly to each other by saying, like, I'm gonna practice being with you, just like Christ did for us. He came to be with us in flesh and do his work for us. Like, we can offer that and reflect that to our spouse, our kids, by saying, okay, well, I'm with you. Like, ultimately, it's affirming that relationship, affirming that the other person matters, that their story matters, giving that equal regard.
mm.
And to do that, you have to let go of criticism and contempt and just show that you care.
Yeah.
And ultimately,
Equal regard. I love
yeah.
that. Yeah. Um, it's hard. Um,
Oh, super.
if you've grown up being criticized,
Yeah.
um, and I'll say this, like if you've grown up in a Christian, home, fundamentalist home, you're more
Yeah.
vulnerable to this. That
Mm-hmm.
there's a right way to do life and do things, and there's a wrong way.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed is that people that grow up in that environment is they learn that they have to make a case and fight for the
Mm.
way they do things and their choices, and so they're constantly like defensive
Yeah.
about what they want, what they need, and it just brings that energy
Yeah.
to like there's no it's hard to have a flow in
Yeah.
your marriage when you're constantly having to fight for like where we go out to eat or how we spend the evening, and what we're going to do for our free time and hobbies or whatever. There's always
Much
has to be a
less,
justification for it.
yeah, much less things that are like petty and small, like how you load the dishwasher, how you cook, how many pans you use,
Right.
that have to be cleaned up, or
Yeah.
if you squeeze the toothpaste from the end or the middle,
Yeah.
like,
That's it's exhausting to fight for every little thing like that.
it
But
is.
that's what happens.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
try to advocate for not arguing, period.
Mm.
Right? Like,
Argument free zone.
yeah,
Like
because,
fasting, Lent. It's Lent.
yeah, give up arguing for Lent, please. Uh, so when this comes out, like, Lent will be over, but try, like, I would challenge you as a listener. I gave sarcasm for Lent one year. It's the best practice I ever did because I realized how destructive it was in relationships. Like, I just encourage you guys as a listener, and even Samana and I will take on this challenge too, but to not argue, just simply commit within yourself to not argue in about an issue or a topic, to like show unconditional care and regard for another human being who's has the same worth and value as yourself, and see how that impacts your relationship. Like, just try it out for 2 weeks. Your relationship will be 10 times better. I can almost guarantee it if you take this seriously and commit to that.
Yeah.
Because
Can you imagine? Like, I know, like, there's a lot of people listening. They're like, I don't know how that's going to be possible or that's going to work.
right.
But I just imagine how much your stress, wherever you're at, scale of 1 to
Yeah.
10, how many notches that would go down if magically there was no arguing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, if you decided it's not worth being right because I'm going to be dead right in this relationship, which means the relationship's going to slowly die.
Ooh, say that again.
Yeah. So someone shared this metaphor with me. If you're approaching an intersection, like you're driving and your partner's approaching from cross traffic, you have the green light and they have the red light, but they're not stopping. You can be right, but you'll be dead right because you'll get T-boned. What is the cost of being right as opposed to being loving or kind? And that's where I would encourage, like,
Yeah.
it's not worth being right. It's worth loving, though. It's worth caring. That's going to take a little sacrifice, letting go of pride and hubris and your ego to engage in humility and loving well. But at what cost are you going to try to be right?
Mm.
It's not worth it.
Man, that you really have to die to yourself
Yeah.
to put, like, for some, putting down the desire or the right to be right
Mm,
aside to choose to be more loving. um yeah, that's good. Scott, what would you say to the other side of that, where
sure.
someone feels like they always give in,
Right.
they're always wrong, and their partner is always right, their partner always gets what they want, and they just get run over all the time? What would you say
Right.
to that person?
Yeah. God doesn't call us to be doormats. Okay. So let's just clearly say that.
Okay.
God does not call us to be doormats. I would say that person's path for growth is assertiveness, and not in being right, but in advocating for their experience, which still requires that extreme ownership with accountability, vulnerability, understanding of themselves, to say, here's what's at stake, and this is what I need,
Hmm.
as opposed to the defensiveness or criticism or contempt that says, you're wrong, right?
So to change that pattern, it isn't to be more vocal about you're wrong and
Right.
criticize. um
It's to take yourself more, to value yourself more, so you're not a doormat in a relationship.
hmm.
But it doesn't come across as aggressive. It comes across as assertive, right?
Hmm.
I'll often tell couples, are you sending an invitation or are you sending an accusation?
Hmm.
Right?
Invitation. So, like, so what would that sound like?
Yeah.
Or
So an invitation
invitation.
is, hey, I just want to share with you uh, what it meant to me to have this happen. And I'm not going to accept this kind of behavior anymore. But I just want you to know how much that hurt. Are you willing to listen? Maybe even before you share, like, why you need to share your experience, just say, hey, are you willing to listen to
That's
me?
the invitation. Are you
That's the
willing to listen?
invitation,
Okay.
right? Like, it's I need to assert from my experience. Like, can we have this conversation?
Mm.
Like,
Okay.
asking for permission. Because if they're not willing to listen, sometimes you still need to say something, especially if it's an abusive or, like, that far into the spectrum that needs intervention and possibly leads to divorce. But you have to assert for yourself, but it starts with permission,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so, because otherwise, and it's about your experience. Like, I'm going to share with you what's going on inside of me. Not, I'm going to share with you what you did wrong, how bad you are, and how much I hate you, right? Because
Hmm.
that takes that internalized work to say, this is what happened. Here's the facts. This is how it made me feel. And what I'd like different is this. Like, can we come to some compromise there? Right?
Yeah.
Like, you're open.
Hmm.
You're addressing behavior, not person.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right? You're not
Yeah.
saying they're worth
The
less.
accusation is when you
Right.
attack the person. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
You make it about their worth and value or character as opposed to saying, hey, can we try something different?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what an invitation looks like.
Yeah. It's nice when we get there.
Oh yeah, it's
It's
so
hard.
refreshing.
It's hard to get there. That's why if you Scott's lining out like how to do this, how to try this on your own. Um, if it's too hard to do on your own, that's where it can help to bring someone in to coach or counsel. You walk you through these hard steps. So we've got one more, Scott.
Yeah, shared
Yeah,
meaning.
shared meaning.
And that, simply put, is the sensitivity to plan life with your partner in mind. I'll
Hmm.
say it again.
Yeah.
Shared meaning is the sensitivity to plan life with your partner in mind. And so the Gottmans talk about bids for connection. And the responses to a bid for connection is either turning towards, which is matching that bid. Whether it's a smile, you smile back. The joke, you laugh at it. Or processing a memory, you show understanding with it and share your experience as well. Right.
Yeah.
Um,
Part of being with.
yeah, it's that
Showing the
being
other
with,
person's with
yeah.
you. Mm.
And you can create a shared meaning around a painful memory too, right? Whether it's an affair, uh,
Mm.
a miscarriage, like that's one that causes so much damage in relationships because people grieve differently, and the lack of understanding or empathy or care for each other's experience of grief and how different that is
Mm.
can lead to divorce. It's a devastating thing. But it can also be just something simple, like I talked about smiling or sharing a joke or planning an event, right? Like
Mm.
something simple like that, those thousands of moments every day where we can turn towards each other and meet them with openness, with curiosity, with empathy, like to do that with your partner in mind. You're creating this shared value of relationship, this shared meaning moving forward, or even about something in the past that was painful. It's when what gets in the way of this would be the opposite, not turning towards the person, your spouse, your kiddo, like in a hard situation, but
Mm.
turning against or away. Right, those are the two options for a bit of connection.
Yeah.
You either come up and like somehow their bid is offensive. Someone smiles at you and you're just in a mood and you're like, what are you smiling about? Right, that doesn't feel very good.
Mm.
Right,
Right. Right.
that's that aggressive stance.
Irritability and just
Yeah.
impatience.
And then the other one is turning away, where it's like you just dismiss it as if they didn't even smile, right? Like
Mm.
you don't change your face. You just kind of, you may even roll your eyes,
Oof. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't feel good. But there are thousands of these little interactions where we can turn towards each other and create this intimacy, this depth in relationship,
Mm.
if
I
we're
like
aware of it.
that. I like that. Um, you hundreds or thousands, each day. Um,
Yeah.
like I just thought of, like, do we turn towards and connect those little moments with our spouse, uh, as much as we turn towards our phone,
Mm.
and connect with our phone,
Ouch, Savon.
you
That's
know.
harsh. How dare you bring my relationship with my phone into this?
the and what we try to do is make up for it with like grand gestures, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And like date night and grand gestures are awesome,
Yeah.
but they don't land as well if you turn away,
Right.
uh all those small moments,
Right.
and it's just it can fall flat. Like like sometimes it can't, like, don't really trust it when you can't even like smile
Yep.
or just be
Right.
kind to me day to day. A lot of people would prefer that to
Yep.
the big things. um
Well, it makes a deposit, right? Like
mm,
we talk about a relationship bank account. You're either making a deposit or a withdrawal. Very rarely is it neutral, right? I'd say I don't know if there is a case where it's neutral.
mm,
your interaction, your engagement is making a deposit in your relationship or a withdrawal. And what we're striving for isn't perfection. There's no way we can fully match every bid for connection by turning towards. But if we do it more often than not through intentionality, I guarantee you're going to have a better relationship.
Yeah.
Like you're making those deposits, which also means when you have conflict or disagreement or frustration, you can weather that better because there's emotional money in the bank. Right. So when you take that withdrawal, it's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
well, there's still some care. There's still some love there. Like, we're good. Yeah. Like, that's okay. Like, it's a lot easier to show grace, be
Mm-hmm.
forgiving,
Yeah.
compassionate.
It's more understanding. Yeah, I ask folks, like when they're struggling, and this is in relationship or even with anxiety or depression, is
Yeah.
do you have more good days than bad?
Yeah.
And with each other, with understanding and conflict, and
Yeah.
check. And if you have more good days, then the imperfections, we can weather that, the disappointments and the misses.
Right.
But when it's like mostly hard and bad and lonely and
Yeah.
disconnected, and then every once in a while you have a good day, it's like, oh man, we're hurting. We're
Oh,
really
yeah.
uh, feeling alone in our
Yeah.
relationship. So the anything more to say about shared meeting?
I think that's good. I mean, we could probably spend an hour on each of these if we really want to do so long,
Yes.
but
Yes. Yeah.
I think that's a good, even long version of explanation right now.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you, Scott, for running us through that. So as we wrap up our time, anything you'd like to share, or um, uh, ways to connect, listeners can connect with you?
Sure. Before I do that, I just want to, if you took one thing away from today, right, as a listener, like I would just encourage you to be aware and notice like what's going on inside of you. Like start there. Start with awareness and see what's possible instead of making reasons why there's no path forward.
Mhm.
Right. So just those two simple things. And I say simple because they are simple. They're not easy. And so I just encourage all of your listeners to want to start with becoming aware of yourself and seeing what's possible, just to make a step in the right direction, not necessarily, or in a healthy direction. I don't even want to say right, because there's so many different ways you can be right and healthy, but a step towards change.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Thank you, Scott. Like even folks that aren't in relationship, right?
right.
That like being aware, and then taking that next step.
What?
They can
Because it
benefit.
starts with yourself, right? Like it's about accepting God's love and grace in your life so that you can live more fully with freedom.
Mm, awesome.
So,
Yes.
yeah, if you want to connect with me on Instagram, I am counselor.scott. On Facebook, it's VC Counseling. I can engage with you through there. And the website is vccounseling.com. And I also have a podcast myself on resilient relationships. So we talk through all these fun things. And that's just the Resilient Relationship Podcast blueberry.net, or you can search Resilient Relationship Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, and it'll be there. So
Great. Yeah, and I'll put those links in the show notes. And you're here in Oregon, down Springfield,
yes.
Eugene area, and
Yeah.
if folks are needing help with their relationship, they can contact your office, and you're doing telehealth.
Yep, I'm doing telehealth. So wherever you are in Oregon, if you need some relationship help, someone to sojourn, to walk with you in your process, maybe learn some new skills, reach out to me. I also have a team of a couple of therapists, and one of them is open to doing relationship stuff too. And so if I can't help you, I'll try to point you to someone who can.
Awesome. Great, Scott. Thank you so much again for coming on the podcast.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Swan.